It was Christmas Eve at the North Pole. Time grew near for Santa's journey to begin. The lights in the toy shop shone brightly, revealing toys stacked end to end. 7 of the elves worked super fast, making the last of the shiny new toys. But the 8th little elf, named Calvin, worked slowly, making lots of noise. Santa examined closely his long Christmas list while relaxing in his favorite chair. He ate a cookie and drank some milk as snowflakes filled the air. The reindeer were anxious to begin the flight along the star-kissed Milky Way. They could hardly wait to hear the bells jingling as they pulled the magical sleigh. Soon a full moon would be rising, and the sleigh would glide through the sky. So hurriedly the elves made toy after toy, but all Calvin did was try. Poor little Calvin. He did his best, but nothing he made looked right. He was forgetful, careless, and slow. His work was truly a sight. He made a doll with bright red hair and dressed her in a calico gown, with rings on her fingers and bows in her hair, but her legs were upside down. He made a wagon and painted it blue, certain some boy it would thrill. But Calvin made a terrible mistake. His wagon had only one wheel. The foreman of the elves was named Heilig. He inspected every single toy. He wanted each gift to be perfect for each special girl and boy. Calvin made a bow and some arrows, while Heilig inspected a swing. Poor Calvin whittled the arrows much too short, and the longbow had no string. Heilig was tired, but there was work to do, no time to waste for a break. There were many toys yet to be inspected. Oh, how his feet did ache. Heilig counted the drums, dolls, and skates. He'd never seen so many toys. There were twice as many as last year, meaning twice as many good girls and boys.
Ho! Every year more children. I'll only have enough toys for the really good boys and girls. Now, let me see. This list gets bigger and bigger every year. My little elves are working very hard to make toys for everyone. But each year it gets harder to fill all the orders. Oh, my goodness! Look at the time.
Noticing the hourglass, Santa jumped to his feet. Valuable time was slipping away. Not another moment could be wasted, or he'd be seen by the light of day. The grains of sand trickled downward as Santa rushed to find his suit. He looked funny, hurrying toward the closet, for Santa wore only one boot. Little Calvin quietly sat in a corner, repairing a large teddy bear. He was sewing one of its blue stuffed legs, one he hadn't meant to tear. Heilig closely inspected Calvin's work. Suddenly, all the mistakes he spied. Calvin looked up to see Heilig's face turn red and wished that he could hide.
What's with you, Nudnik? My shop makes beautiful toys. Everyone but you, that is. I've told you all year. You have to pay attention. Say something.
I'm sorry. I really have been trying. I didn't do it on purpose.
Purpose? Purpose, he says.
Yes, they were accidents.
There've been too many accidents. Every few minutes it's something else. Ridiculous dolls, torn teddy bears, unusable wagons, and look at that bow and arrow. Useless! Calvin, you just don't pay attention. Now I have no other alternative but to fire you. You can help tonight, but this is your last day. Do you understand, Calvin? You're fired!
Large tears slipped down Calvin's cheeks as he thought of being sent away. He knew he'd miss his North Pole friends and have a miserable Christmas day. Calvin loved living at Santa's North Pole. It had been his only home. He looked at his friends for the very last time and sadly felt alone. He purposely paused to tell them goodbye, but they pretended not to see. Calvin knew he'd failed to be one of them. They were as ashamed as he. Calvin then wondered what Santa would say when reading the dismissal note. Curiously, he wondered where Santa would send him as he laced his tiny tan coat.
Oh, Calvin, what am I going to do with you? I told you you have to pay attention. You're a good elf, but you're careless. I'm too busy right now to discuss it. You go out there and help, if they want you, and we'll talk about it when I come back.
The barn was warm and quiet within as Calvin gently caressed the deer. With tears in his eyes, he hugged each one of them and tightly held each one near. Curiously, they wondered, why is Calvin sad? Before, his visits were fun. They loved all of the elves dearly, but Calvin was their favorite one. It's a stupid dream, thought Calvin, to think of asking to be rehired. Facts were facts with no turning back, and the fact remained. Calvin was fired. The deer watched Calvin dry his tears as he sat on a bale of hay. They moved closer to try and comfort him, wishing there was something they could say.
Are all the toys finished now, Heilig?
Yes, sir. Every last one of them. Even the ones Calvin ruined.
He would be a good boy if he would just learn to pay attention. Perhaps I can have a talk with him when I get back and give him another chance.
We can't talk about it now, Santa. You're late.
So I am.
Santa quickly checked the last name on his list. Seeing the nearly empty hourglass, he sighed. Jumpin' reindeer, where had the time gone? Hurry, hurry, to Heilig, he cried. So little time and so much to do, thought Santa as he jumped to his feet. He must go to the closet to get his red coat. He had a special schedule to meet. Heilig tried to help Santa prepare his clothes. There wasn't a single moment to spare. Hurriedly, he shook Santa's fur-trimmed costume as the smell of mothballs filled the air. The elves began packing Santa's red bags, getting them ready to load on the sleigh. They thought of the children's surprise and delight when awakening on Christmas Day. The elves packed gifts large and small. What a wonderful holiday it would be. The children would be glad that they had been good when finding their gifts under the tree. The bags grew larger with each new toy. They began bulging from side to side. Finally, the last toy was packed snugly within, and the ropes on the bags were tied. The elves quickly inspected the now empty room. They examined the bags once more. They knew that Santa was impatiently waiting as the bags were lifted from the floor.
I hope everything's ready. My, I really must get on my way.
It was difficult placing the bags on the sleigh. The elves feared they were much too wide. They contained so many large toys, they wondered where Santa would ride. They pushed and pulled with all their might, trying to make the bags fit in place. They never noticed Calvin behind the sleigh watching, or saw his sad little face. Together they gave one last big push. To their surprise, the bags finally fit. The sleigh was filled from front to back, still leaving room for Santa to sit. The elves had completed their work for the year. Exhausted, they went away, as little Calvin stood alone beside the deer, looking at Santa's toy-filled sleigh. The elves straightened the workbenches, putting their tools away. They looked forward to a long night's sleep and turkey on Christmas Day.
Very good, very good.
Before I go, I must thank all the elves. They've worked very hard this year and deserve a good dinner and some rest. Merry Christmas, everyone. Thanks for your hard work.
Merry Christmas, Santa!
If you need anything when you get back, just call me.
I don't think that will be necessary. Now I must hurry.
The toy shop looked neat with everything in place. Each elf sat down with a sigh. Meanwhile, Calvin stood watching the deer, wondering how Santa made them fly. Calvin stood by the deer as snowflakes fell, wishing he could deliver the toys. He thought of the fun Santa must have when visiting the girls and boys. He decided to play a game of make-believe. It surely would be lots of fun. He looked around, then climbed into the sleigh. It was something he'd never done. Calvin took the deer reins in his small hands as the cold north winds blew. He paused for a moment in his game of pretend, wondering, what now would Santa do? Trying to look like Santa, Calvin threw out his chest, then tugged at his make-believe beard. He whistled loudly as he stood in the sleigh. There was nothing Calvin feared.
Stop! Stop! I didn't want you to go! Go back! I don't know how to drive this sleigh! Oh, dear me!
Frightened Calvin clutched tightly the reins, wondering how he could turn the deer around. Oh, how he wished he'd never pretended to be Santa and was safely back on the ground. He shouted loudly as the sleigh zigged and zagged, but the deer heard not a word. The north wind made his voice sound like a whisper. Poor Calvin couldn't be heard.
Stop! Please go back! Oh, dear me!
The elves had discovered the missing sleigh when coming to tell Santa goodbye. They searched all around the snow-covered ground, wondering how and why. The deer or the sleigh weren't anywhere to be seen. Even the tracks were covered with snow. The elves searched and searched the entire place, looking high and low. They searched every inch of the large red barn, thinking the deer had wandered in from the cold. Discovering the barn empty, they knew something was wrong, and Santa must be told.
I can't believe it, Santa. Your sleigh has disappeared.
dear me! Heilig is really going to punish me now! Stop! Stop! Please go back! They don't seem to hear me!
We've looked everywhere.
Oh, those poor children with no toys.
I wonder who could have taken the sleigh. Maybe it was a big monster.
Oh, don't be silly. There aren't any big monsters. The deer must have wandered off somewhere.
But we've looked everywhere except up in the sky. They wouldn't fly away without someone at the reins.
I can't believe that for the first time in the history of Santa Claus, the children of the world are going to be disappointed. Oh, what a sad Christmas day!
And after all our hard work, if the elves don't find the sleigh soon, it will be too late.
Christmas Eve at the North Pole became the most unhappy night of the year. The elves sadly thought of the children waiting for Santa. Even Heilig shed a tear. The elves all decided to return to the barn. There must be a clue somewhere near. Who'd ever heard of a missing sleigh, toy bags, and all those reindeer?
After all those hours and hours and hours of making toys.
Heilig, if the sled is missing, I know I'm going to be late. What are we going to do about it? Can't you think of something? Think, man. What are we going to do?
Now let me see. I should just think a little bit. Over there is Polaris, the North Star. Under the North Star is the North Pole. And next to the North Pole is Santa's house. So if I follow the North Star, I'll find Santa's house.
Following the North Star, Calvin breathed a sigh. The right direction he'd found. The deer began gliding slowly downward as Calvin saw the snow-covered ground. In the faint distance, Calvin then saw the barn. Smoke from Santa's chimney drew near. Closer they came to the bright lights in the toy shop. There'd never been a sight so dear. Soon the sleigh runners touched the ground, sliding through the cold, deep snow. The deer stopped quickly in front of Santa's house as Calvin wondered, did anyone know? Calvin noticed the loose rope on the toy bag as he looked for a place to hide. Quickly, he pulled the top wide open and nimbly squeezed inside.
Hurry, Santa. The sleigh's in front of the house.
It just appeared by magic.
Maybe the reindeer ran away by themselves.
They wouldn't do a thing like that. They've never done that before. We'll solve the mystery when I get back. I haven't a moment to lose. Now I must see all the good children.
Santa was concerned about leaving so late as he climbed into the bright, shiny sleigh. He knew he must travel faster than ever before due to the unexplained delay.
Merry Christmas, everyone!
Higher and higher Santa guided the deer, darting through the darkness of night. Unknown to Santa, Calvin secretly hid in the toy bag, going on another unexpected flight.
Merry Christmas, everybody!
The elves were happy the sleigh had returned, and Santa could deliver the toys. It would be a Merry Christmas after all, for thousands of girls and boys.
Let's go to bed. Merry Christmas, men, and thanks for a good year.
It is going to be a glorious season.
Time was drawing near for Santa's first stop as the sleigh drifted toward the ground. Calvin slipped deeper within the bag, fearful of being found.
Merry Christmas, everyone!
Santa dusted the chimney soot from his clothes, then slipped shiny ice skates under the tree. The gift was for a little Canadian boy who'd been as good can be. Santa entered the second house through a window. It had no fireplace, and someone had locked the door. Upside down, Calvin dared not yell when accidentally the bag was dropped to the floor. The children next on the list lived in a house of ice. It was an igloo, large and warm. Santa gave each child a pair of fur-lined boots, a sled, and a reindeer charm. One of Santa's stops was a dainty Swiss home. The tree was decorated with different wedges of cheese. As he placed the toys, Santa nibbled a star, and the strange odor made Santa sneeze. Santa then entered an Oriental home. His journey had been 6 hours long. When placing the gifts, he heard a loud noise, which was only a large brass gong. He visited a home called an orphanage, leaving 22 pairs of skates. He then filled 22 stockings and departed for the United States. After hundreds of visits, Santa reached his last stop. He was so exhausted he could hardly see. He dropped his bag as he sat down to rest beside a colorful Christmas tree. Upstairs in her bedroom, Kim, a little girl, slept. She was dreaming of what Santa would bring, snuggling closely to a brown teddy bear, hoping for a big doll and a swing. She dreamed of 3 stockings hanging in a row, stuffed with goodies from toe to the knee. Even in dreams, she could hardly wait to discover the gifts under the tree. The last of the toys had been orderly placed. Tired Santa could hardly stay awake. Accidentally, Calvin had been removed from the bag and given as a gift by mistake. Kim slept soundly as dawn drew near. The night was slipping away. Little did she know she'd be the only child in the world to receive an elf on Christmas Day.
Merry Christmas, everyone! Merry Christmas, and to all a good night!
The lights on the tree softly twinkled. Calvin was quiet as a mouse. He wished he was back at Santa's North Pole. He didn't like being in a stranger's house. Sitting on the floor, Calvin began to cry as a tree bulb lit up his ear. If only he hadn't hidden the toy bag. He knew he wouldn't be here. Santa directed the deer and sleigh homeward as he watched the dim light of morning appear. He was glad all the toys had been delivered at last, and it would be a Merry Christmas this year. The bells on the sleigh jingled loudly as it quickly flew through the sky. Closer they came to the cold North Pole as Santa yawned with a sigh.
Now I'm really going to go to bed.
So am I. I can't remember a Christmas that came so close to not happening.
Calvin knew he would soon be discovered. Desperately, he wondered what he should do. Could he hide somewhere? Or perhaps run away? He knew his choices were few. He looked at the toys, so quiet, so still. Then an idea entered his mind. Why, he'd pretend to be one of them, and an elf doll the children would find.
Dear Santa Claus, I have been a very good girl all year. Please bring me a doll and a swing and some coloring books. If you don't think that's too much, thank you and Merry Christmas. Love, Kim.
Calvin wondered how an elf doll felt. He tried to look sort of dumb. He crossed his legs and made his arms limp, pretending to be lifeless and numb. Christmas morning had finally arrived as the excited children examined the toys. Their parents opened beautifully wrapped gifts. Poor Calvin was alarmed by the noise.
Oh, look what I got. A beautiful little doll. Look what Santa Claus brought me.
Santa Claus? He wouldn't bring a thing like that. Somebody else gave it to you for Christmas.
Where did Kim get that, Mother?
I don't really know. I guess Santa Claus did bring it. I think he's sort of cute. Don't you, Kim?
Oh, yes, I love him. That's just what I wanted, a little doll.
Little Kim took Calvin into her arms. She felt Sherry and Robert were being unfair. It didn't matter, her doll wasn't perfect, and she pretended not to care. The gifts were scattered about the room as the children played with each new thing. Kim held tightly her new elf doll while examining an unassembled swing.
I still think Kim's doll is funny looking.
Look at those funny legs and funny ears. He's not funny looking. He's very nice and I love him. I'm glad Santa Claus brought him to me.
Santa Claus? You know there really isn't a Santa Claus. I wonder where Mother and Father got that silly doll.
Sherry laughed at Calvin's short little legs. Robert made fun of his large ears. Kim's feelings were hurt because they were being unkind, and she ran from the room in tears. Drying her tears, Kim noticed Calvin's hands. Curiously, his little fingers she began to feel. Looking at his face, she saw his eyes blink. Why, he wasn't a doll. He was real. Her large blue eyes widened in surprise. Calvin knew he could no longer pretend. Kim then smiled warmly and tickled his nose. She wanted to be his friend.
I'm gonna be your friend. My name's Kim. What's your name?
My name's Calvin, and I come from the North Pole. I used to work for Santa Claus, and now I'm here with you.
You're in the United States, and now you belong to me. You're my own little real doll, and we're gonna have lots of fun. So don't be afraid.
I'm not afraid.
Calvin tried very hard to return her smile when he saw Kim wasn't anyone to fear. Shyly, he tugged at his little coat, then smiled from ear to ear. Kim neatly straightened Calvin's collar, then helped him to his feet. Politely, she said, "How do you do?" An elf she was pleased to meet. Calvin then explained what had happened. She listened closely to every word. It was certainly a strange Christmas story, unlike any she'd ever heard. He told her about Heilig and the elves, about the magic deer and sleigh. Calvin described how he'd hid in the toy bag and was delivered on Christmas Day. Kim thought it was an exciting story, but the ending made her sad. She knew that Calvin missed his home and was sorry that he'd been bad.
Calvin, you know you should have paid more attention to your work. You would have done well if you would have kept your mind on your work. No one can do anything right thinking about other things.
I know. I realize it now that it's too late. If I ever get another chance, I'm going to be the best worker Santa Claus has.
Don't be sad, Calvin. You and I are gonna have fun together.
Kim tried her best to cheer Calvin. She introduced him to her friend, Mr. Bear. Calvin became more interested in eating as the aroma of bacon filled the air. Calvin shyly told Kim he was hungry and asked for something to eat. His stomach growled as she left the room. Anything would be a treat.
Mother, Calvin is hungry. I would like to have something to eat for Calvin.
Calvin? Who's Calvin?
That's my elf that Santa gave me for Christmas. And you know something, Mother? He's alive.
Really, Kim. Sometimes your imagination goes too far.
But it's true, Mother. He's a live elf from the North Pole, and Santa Claus gave him to me by mistake. And now he says he's hungry.
All right, dear. If you want to have a little tea party for your elf, whatever his name is, you may have it. Now hurry with the food, as your little Calvin will starve.
Thank you, and thank you for Calvin.
Kim quickly returned to her bedroom, carrying lots of food on a plate. They sat at a little round table as Calvin ate and ate. Kim thought it was fun to have a live doll, one that could walk and talk. She then told Calvin they would play school as she brought out a blackboard and chalk. Kim drew a strange-looking picture. It was a face wearing a frown. She told Calvin it was a picture of him with a smile upside down. Together they wrote their ABCs and drew a picture of Santa's sleigh. They became covered with colored chalk as morning slipped away.
Look at you, Calvin. You got chalk all over your face.
Well, wipe it off!
Where's Kim?
She's still in her room with that funny-looking doll.
She told me he was alive and they're having a tea party.
That's silly. Why do you let her do that?
It doesn't really matter, and it keeps her occupied. You all did things like that when you were little.
I never pretended I had a live elf.
Oh, you did other things. Now just leave her alone as long as she'll be quiet.
Kim then produced puzzles from a drawer. A contest would be lots of fun. Whoever finished first would win the game. Listening, Calvin munched on a bun. Eating now a red candied apple, Calvin was certain he'd win. But Kim finished first as Calvin searched for a puzzle piece stuck to his chin. The elves had discovered Calvin was missing. They wondered where he could possibly be. They searched every corner of the toy shop. They even looked under the tree. They looked under the wide workbenches, peeked in nearly empty buckets of glue. Heilig searched in a closet and found a mouse and began chasing it with his shoe.
We've looked all over for Calvin, and he's nowhere to be found. He's so thoughtless. He could have done almost anything.
Now, he's not really that bad of a boy. He must be around someplace. You must keep looking. I want to have a talk with him.
If it's about rehiring him, I'm against it.
The elves had searched the entire shop, and Calvin wasn't anywhere within. Heilig motioned for the elves to follow. They would search the barn again. The 7 elves inspected the barn, searching it through and through. They looked in the feed bin and in the loft as the forceful north wind blew. The elves were searching Santa's house when they entered the laundry room. Heilig decided to look in the clothes bag. Carrying it, he tripped on a broom. The dirty clothes were scattered about, cluttering the laundry room floor. Bending to pick them up, Heilig mumbled as he bumped his head on the door. Heilig noticed the clothes covered with soot. Seeing the toy bag, he wanted to shout. Why couldn't Santa ever remember? The dirty bag should be turned inside out. A piece of paper fell from the bag. Heilig thought he had seen it before. Quickly, he summoned all the elves, removing the note from the floor. As the elves drew near, they saw the note. It was last seen in Calvin's hand. Heilig felt sure he knew what had happened. Explaining, he took command. The elves listened closely as Heilig spoke. Looking at the bag, they imagined Calvin inside. Why, Calvin must have been delivered. He'd certainly chosen the wrong place to hide. They entered Santa's room, giving him the note. He could hardly believe his sight. Carefully, he wondered what he could do. He knew Heilig's theory was right.
Poor little Calvin. He must be miserable. We'll have to make a plan to get him back.
Santa, maybe I was too harsh with him. I hope he's all right.
Calvin and Kim began to talk, wondering if Calvin had been missed. If so, could Santa possibly remember the last names on his Christmas list? Calvin became homesick and worried, but he tried not to let it show. Oh, how he wished he was home again, eating ice cream made of snow. Kim tried very hard to cheer Calvin, but there was little she could do. She told him to make a Christmas wish, and perhaps it would come true. Kim told him she truly believed in wishing, but only for a very special cause. Crossing their fingers and closing their eyes, they wished for Santa Claus.
Hello, Mr. President. This is Mr. Santa Claus. I have a very special favor to ask of you. I must get a new visa to visit the United States because one of my elves was lost, and I must get him back. I'm sure you'll understand, and I promise to wear regular clothes.
Strangely dressed, Santa climbed into the sleigh. The elves liked his foolproof disguise. He wore a raincoat and a tan straw hat, as sunglasses covered his eyes. Santa peered over the rim of his glasses. He hoped his plan would succeed. He shook the reins and whistled loudly. His command the deer did heed.
This is the place where all the kids come to play.
We don't have anything like this in the North Pole.
Kim proudly took Calvin outdoors to play. Her elf she wanted everyone to see. But Calvin knew his secret must be kept, and a doll he must pretend to be. The children first stared at Calvin, then began laughing and making fun. They'd never seen a doll so ugly, and were glad they hadn't received one. Such pointed ears they'd never seen. His legs made him look like a bird. Protectively, Kim held Calvin tightly, pretending she hadn't heard a word. One little girl tried to imitate Calvin, appearing to look lifeless and numb. Then a little boy tugged at his ears, making fun of the doll so dumb. Poor little Calvin wanted to yell, but he dared not make a sound. He wished the children would go away, but instead they gathered around. The children laughed and pointed at Calvin. He was the funniest sight they'd seen. Kim became angry with her playmates. They'd never been so cruel or mean.
Quit that. Calvin's my doll and he's not ugly.
Look at those funny ears.
Look at those funny feet.
Look at those silly clothes.
They're not silly. He's an elf and I love him. How can anyone love a doll like that? I think he's funny looking.
Yeah, so do I.
Quit talking like that. He's my Christmas present and I love him.
Santa secretly hid the deer and the sleigh in a place where they couldn't be found. He told them he'd continue the journey by plane as they listened, not making a sound. Santa finally had reached the large city as a door-to-door search began. He discovered some people to be unfriendly. After all, he was a strange-looking man. Santa felt he'd walked 100 miles as he searched the south of town. He sat down to rest on a green park bench, relaxing as he looked around. The blue water rippled before him. Towering buildings stood to his right. He watched the trees move with the breeze. It was certainly a beautiful sight. Santa rode a bus to the north of town. Another search he was ready to try. He wondered if people questioned his raincoat when there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Santa entered the gate of a large white house. A sleeping dog he didn't see. The dog began barking and gave quite a chase, and Santa ran for the nearest tree. Santa saw children playing hide and seek. They were having lots of fun. Santa peered from behind a large palm tree and was surprised by a water-filled gun. Wondering where Calvin could possibly be, Santa shook his head with a sigh. Somewhere Calvin was waiting. He'd find him, or at least he'd try.
Calvin's hungry again, Mother.
That doll of yours certainly eats a lot for a little toy elf.
He's not a toy, Mother. He's real. He's a real elf and he's hungry.
Turkey, dressing, and applesauce cake was given to Kim on a tray. Her mother knew Calvin wasn't at all real. It was only a game Kim pretended to play. The food was placed on the little table. Kim arranged seats for 3. Calvin, Kim, and the little brown bear were quite a trio to see. Calvin ate so much his tummy bulged. Kim feared he would soon turn blue. But Calvin ate the last crumb on the plate. He was full, but miserable too.
You shouldn't eat so much, Calvin.
When morning came, Santa felt much better. He had rented a room for the night. His search continued as a playground he spied, and children came into sight. Santa moved closer, hearing the noise. He wondered what the commotion was about. The children were huddled by the swings. "Big ears," he heard one boy shout. Calling each other names wasn't at all nice, thought Santa, listening to the noise. Next year, they'd be sorry to discover no Christmas toys.
He doesn't have big ears. That's the way elves all look.
The children joined hands, forming a circle, securing Calvin and Kim inside. They made fun of Kim's little elf doll as his ears she tried to hide. Calvin became frightened by the children's noise. He didn't understand their teasing for fun. Tears filled Kim's eyes as she started to cry, and home she wanted to run. Sherry and Robert felt sorry for Kim. They distracted their friends with a game. While everyone played, Kim held her doll tightly and in the sand wrote Calvin's name. Calvin noticed the stranger drawing near. He could hardly believe his eyes. Jumping reindeer! It was Santa, wearing a strange disguise. Santa was certain at last he'd found Calvin as he hurried toward the children at play. He watched Kim holding tightly her doll and wondered what he could possibly say.
Kim, I think I see a friend of mine. See that man over there by the fence? He looks very much like someone I know.
How could you know anyone down here? You just got here and it doesn't look like anyone I know. An old man with a white beard?
He looks very familiar. Maybe we should go over and say hello.
My mother told me never to talk to strangers. No, we're gonna stay here.
Hello, Kim. Is that your Christmas present?
Yes, sir. His name is Calvin.
Isn't that nice? Say, what's that old man loitering around for? I'm going to have to talk to him.
Oh, no. Poor Santa Claus.
Slowly, Santa turned and walked away. There was nothing he could say or do. Even if he told the policeman who he was, he'd never believe it was true. Leaving the park, Santa felt very sad, thinking he may never find Calvin again. Santa never noticed two boys on a bike racing through the playground sand. The boys were older and chose to play rough. They stole Sherry and Robert's ball. They bullied the children as they climbed on the swings. Calvin wished that one would fall.
Kim, I don't like those naughty boys. Let's go home.
One of the boys saw the doll Kim was holding. He wanted his friends, the dummy, to see. They gathered around and began to laugh. Calvin thought, "The dummy's not me."
He doesn't have big ears. That's the way all elves look. I don't like those big boys. They always come over here and tease the little kids. Leave me alone. We're playing and we don't want any big boys around.
Robert saw the boys were frightening Kim. He told them to go away. The tallest boy shoved him to the ground. Robert had nothing else to say. The boys then went into a huddle. Sherry took Kim by the hand. She told Robert it was time to go home, as the boys whispered a plan. Before anyone knew what had happened, the boys grabbed Calvin and ran. They jumped on their bikes and raced away as Kim fell helpless in the sand.
Bring back my doll. That's my doll. Calvin, don't let them take you away.
The boys took Calvin to a large field. They laughed about what they had done. Calvin listened closely as they talked, wondering, how could stealing be fun? The boys momentarily forgot about Calvin. Soon, he discovered why. They were looking at a model plane, talking about how fast it could fly. Calvin had never seen a model so big. He thought, flying it sure must be fun. He wished that Santa's bag had been larger, so he could have delivered every boy one. One of the boys spoke of the plane. It was the best toy he'd ever had. Calvin knew he wouldn't have received it at all if Santa had known he was bad.
Oh, no! They're not going to do that to me!
They can't put me on that airplane. I'm too big. Besides, I don't know how to fly.
Calvin was tied on top of the plane. Jumpin' reindeer! He couldn't fly. One of the boys spoke of remote control, explaining how it worked and why.
All we have to do now is start the engine. We're gonna make this dummy the pilot. I bet he'll be the best pilot there ever was.
He's a little big to be the pilot of this plane.
Don't worry, it'll carry him. I think he's gonna look cool flying along.
Okay, hurry up. Let's get it started.
They started the engine after checking the fuel. Calvin was to ride his first real plane. They laughed at the dummy looking so stupid. It seemed they'd given Calvin a name. The propeller of the plane rapidly turned. As the ground disappeared from sight, upward it flew as Calvin braced himself for his very first airplane flight. The plane tilted, right, left, then right, circling high above the ground. Suddenly it began turning over. Calvin was flying upside down.
Oh! 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 Look at everything upside down! This makes me feel sick!
Slowly the plane turned right side up. Calvin could see the boys below. Feeling dizzy, he wished it would land, but straight upward the plane did go. The boys took turns taking control as each maneuvered the craft. They thrilled with delight to see the grand flight, while at the dummy they laughed.
Look at the chimneys and people! Ooh! Oh, wow! I see a wire! I wonder where it goes to! Oh my goodness! I think I'm going too fast! Gee, I wish my head felt better! All the blood is rushing to my head! Everything is happening so fast! Oh, I'm dizzy! Oh my! Look at all the people go by so fast!
One boy asked how low the plane could fly. His friend pointed to a tree. Checking the control, they navigated the plane. This would be fun to see.
Let's see how close we can get it to the tree.
Be careful.
Suddenly the plane went into a nosedive. Its target, the tree on the ground. Louder and louder its engine roared. It could be heard for miles around. Closer and closer it came to the tree. Calvin thought for sure he was doomed. He expected the worst, preparing to crash, when upward he suddenly zoomed.
Boy, look at that. I made it zoom up.
Let me try.
No, I want to do it.
Calvin wondered if he was dead or alive as the aircraft began to glide. Meanwhile, the boys were thrilled by the stunt as Calvin was shaking from the ride. Up and down, around and around, the plane was remotely controlled, first flying high and then flying low. Calvin was getting brave and bold. The wings of the plane were spread like an eagle, as through the air like a jet it soared. The boys had never seen anything like it. They watched as the engine roared.
Let me see. These boys are controlling it from the ground. Maybe there's some way to control it from up here.
Suddenly the plane seemed out of control. The boys were filled with concern. Examining closely the master switch, the problem they tried to learn. Calvin had discovered by moving a wire, the plane would fly off course. Now the boys were extremely worried. The problem was getting worse. Santa was discouraged as he wandered about. He spotted the boys flying a plane. When he saw Calvin, he feared for his life and loudly shouted his name. Calvin knew his wish had been granted when sighting Santa below. He pulled and pushed on the wire. Downward he wanted to go. The boys did their best to gain control as the plane circled the sky. But Calvin was determined he'd fly the plane, or at least he was going to try.
My, I think Calvin's gained control of the aircraft. My.
The problem, the boys thought, had been discovered when briefly the plane responded to control. They watched it closely, with fingers crossed, while nearby, Santa pretended to stroll. Suddenly, the plane began flying downward, heading straight for a traffic light. The boys tried to guide the plane upward. Poor Santa was filled with fright.
Oh, look out. It's gonna crash into the street. Look out. Pull it up. I can't.
There seemed to be nothing the boys could do. Only Calvin could pilot that flight. As he pulled on the wire, the plane tilted upward and by inches missed the light. Santa stood watching in absolute disbelief. It was a miracle before his eyes. He scratched his beard as he wondered, had Calvin made the plane rise? All through the sky the model plane flew. Calvin knew it was Santa he had spied. He pushed and pulled on the rudder, and the plane weaved from side to side. Staring at the controls, the boys were confused. Its signals were totally dead. The plane should have crashed long ago, but it continued to fly instead.
Flying's fun, now that I'm not afraid.
Learning quickly, Calvin knew how to fly, but was uncertain how to land. The boys looked upward, not saying a word. Of their plane, Calvin had taken command. Calvin thought and thought about what to do, to land on the street below. He wished he'd made the plane in the toy shop. Then he would surely know. The plane began making an unusual noise. Out of gas, it began to glide. Calvin tried to direct it toward the street as the wings dipped down to the side. It was a lucky break for Calvin, the pilot, that the fuel had all been used. For slowly the wheels of the plane touched the street. He landed without even a bruise.
Oh, Calvin, you've come back. Those naughty boys. I knew they couldn't keep you very long. Are you hurt, Calvin?
No, I had to get control and get back here.
Santa paced back and forth, wondering. Now what was he going to do? There had to be a way to get Calvin back. Suddenly, a way Santa knew. Kim was happy her elf doll was safe. She told him she was glad he'd returned. Calvin asked her to please listen closely, and his secret she soon would learn.
Now, Calvin, you must tell me everything.
All right, but you'll have to promise never to tell anyone else. While I was flying, I saw Santa Claus, and he has come to get me and take me back to the North Pole. That is, if he still wants me. You know, Kim, if I ever get another chance, I'm going to work hard and pay attention and not make any more mistakes.
Oh, Calvin, I don't want you to go away. We had so much fun together.
Santa had borrowed a very large truck and was returning to the home of Kim. He thought of all that had happened to Calvin, hoping it had been a lesson to him. As Santa drove the truck down the street, he planned what next he would do. He had to be careful with every move, for he needed Kim's help, too. The truck stopped in front of Kim's house. Santa saw the boys had found their plane. He looked at each one closely, memorizing each one's name. Hopefully, Santa approached the house and loudly knocked on the door. Kim heard her mother talking to Santa. the stranger Calvin mentioned before.
We're collecting toys for next year. I'm sure with all the nice new things your children receive this Christmas, they won't mind giving up a few of their old and broken playthings.
Maybe the other children have some things. Aren't you a little early this year, though? Usually you come around much later in the year.
Oh, there are getting to be so many children that we have to start early. It takes a while to get them fixed and painted, you know.
I guess you're right. I'll see what the other children have. I'm sure we can find something for you.
I understand you received a funny little doll for Christmas, and since he isn't really what you wanted, maybe you could donate him.
But I love him. He's my own little elf doll.
I'm going to tell you this, and you're the first little child in the world ever to see me. But I'm Santa Claus, and I really need little Calvin to help me.
Looking at Kim holding Calvin tightly, Santa knew she loved him too. Patiently, he watched and waited, wondering what the little girl would do. It was difficult for Kim to make a decision. Should she keep Calvin or let him go? He had told her he wanted to go home, but she felt she'd miss him so. Kim looked at Santa and then at her doll. The North Pole was where Calvin belonged. Hesitantly, she extended him to Santa. Thanking her, he waved and was gone. Taking Calvin under his arm, toward the street, Santa hurriedly walked. As the boys carried the plane, Calvin saluted. They saw the doll they'd mocked.
Look at that! That doll's walking.
Yeah, he's getting into the truck with the old man.
The boys watched Santa place him in the truck, and then stepped toward the steering wheel. They were stunned by what they'd seen. Was it possible the dummy was real? Santa was overjoyed to have again found Calvin, but he knew he wasn't home yet. The children watched as he drove down the street, not knowing it was Santa they'd met. Kim and her mother stood in front of the house, watching the truck go out of sight. Kim missed Calvin, but she was certain that the decision she had made was right.
Goodbye, Calvin. I'll always remember the fun we had. And remember, you promised to be good.
At the airport, Calvin pretended to be a doll. The customs agent wondered what he should do. There was something strange about that toy, but he nodded and let it pass through. The plane carried a happy elf homeward. Santa told him where he'd hidden the deer. Calvin was anxious to see all of his friends, but Heilig he dreaded to hear. The reindeer were safely waiting. Santa and Calvin climbed in a sleigh. Soon the bells on the harness were jingling as Santa reined them on their way. Through the air the reindeer sped. The cold north wind began to blow. Anxious to return to the warmth of the barn, the deer hurried through the falling snow. The elves were thrilled with Calvin's return. Joyfully, they jumped up and down. That is, all of the elves except Heilig. He watched, not making a sound. Calvin truly wanted to be Heilig's friend and prove he could make perfect toys. As Heilig listened, he knew Calvin was sincere. He'd learned a lot from the girls and boys. The elves were happy, for Calvin was rehired. He wasn't going to be sent away. Although it was the beginning of a new work year, it was like another Christmas Day. Starting his special list for next year, Santa relaxed in his favorite chair. Certain boys needed to be watched more closely. Giving gifts to naughty children wasn't fair.
No, sir. No toys for bad girls and boys. I'm going to keep my eyes on those boys down in the United States. They were wrong being mean to little children. They'd better be careful. Now, let's see. I have to check my list again.
All right, men, we've had enough rest. We're starting in on the toys for next year. Calvin, you start working over there on that drum. And 2 of you start on that slide. And the rest of you find something to do. We all have lots of work to do. That's it. Now let's get this workshop humming. Are you doing better, Calvin?
Oh, yes. I have no trouble when I pay attention. You're going to be proud of me, Heilig. Just wait and see.
The little elves began making new toys. Calvin discovered how work could be fun. Heilig laughed as the first toy was finished, and Calvin held up a drum. Santa recalled the unselfish little girl who had given up a toy so dear. He took a pencil and wrote Calvin a note requesting a special doll for next year. Santa knew there were many toys to be made. As his list began to grow, he made plans to secretly visit each good child. Who they were, only Santa would know. Calvin had received Santa's message and began making a special toy. He knew the gift would be perfect, and Kim would be delighted with joy.
Welcome back, Calvin. All the little children in the world need toys, and we must make them correctly.
Heilig inspected the newly made toys before storing them on a shelf. He chuckled when seeing Calvin's perfect doll, for it looked just like Calvin himself. The drum and the doll were only the beginning, as Calvin worked super fast. He had finally become a perfect elf. Never again would he finish last.
Being a good worker is easy and lots of fun. See what I've done by paying attention? And by the way, a Merry Christmas to everyone!
That's right, Calvin. May I say the same thing? Now remember, be good little girls and boys. A Merry Christmas, everyone!